The air in the courtroom was thick, so thick it felt like even a whisper might shatter it. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Shoulders pressed close, eyes fixed on the bench at the front of the room. Reporters clutched their notepads. Jurors shifted in their seats, and the weight of a high-profile case pressed down on everyone. Like a storm about to break. At the center of it all sat Judge Marcus Ellison, a man of calm stature, tall and composed. His very presence commanded attention. His robe was crisp, his expression measured, but his eyes carried a depth decades of hard-fought battles in the justice system. For him, every trial was more than paperwork and rulings. It was a matter of dignity, truth, and fairness. And yet, across the room stood someone determined to undermine all of that. Detective Richard Halliday, cocky, and used to being the loudest voice in any room. He swaggered with the kind of arrogance that turned heads. Hale had cracked big cases. Sure, but it wasn't his record that filled him with confidence. It was his belief that his badge made him untouchable. Your Honor? Hale smirked as he adjusted his tie, his voice dripping with condescension. I hope you'll be able to keep up with the details. This isn't the kind of case they usually hand to, well, just anyone. A ripple of unease moved through the courtroom. Some gasped, others exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. The words were cloaked in politeness, but everyone could hear the insult buried inside. Judge Ellison didn't flinch. His hands rested calmly on the bench, his face unreadable. He had faced worse in his career: snide remarks, outright hostility, and challenges to his authority, but each time, he had stood firm. Still, the sting was real, and the room knew it. The prosecutor glanced toward the judge nervously. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. The jury, 12 ordinary citizens, sat wide-eyed watching a clash unfold that wasn't even part of the case at hand. Detective Hal wasn't done. He leaned against the witness stand casually, as if the courtroom was his stage. I've been in law enforcement for 20 years. I've seen judges come and go. Some know the streets, others just sit behind a desk. But me, I've lived it. I know what justice looks like. His eyes flicked to the judge with an almost mocking gleam. Not sure everyone in this room can say the same. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. It wasn't just arrogance anymore, it was a direct challenge to the judge's credibility. But Ellison remained composed, his silence sharper than any rebuttal. That stillness, that refusal to react, carried more power than raised voices ever could. His gaze swept the room slowly, landing on no one in particular yet, reminding everyone of where authority truly rested. Inside, however, a storm brewed. He had fought years to sit on that bench. Years of being doubted, questioned, and dismissed because of who he was, not what he was capable of. And here, in front of a packed courtroom, someone dared to strip him of that dignity with smirks and subtle insults. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably near the bench. The jurors sat frozen, eyes darting between the detective and the judge. No one dared to move. Even the tick of the clock seemed louder than it should have been. Detective Hale, mistaking the judge's silence for weakness, pushed further. See, when you've been in real danger, when you've walked into crime scenes with your own life on the line, you learn who can actually handle justice and who just talks about it. I guess today we'll find out which one you are. It was bold, reckless, the kind of statement that could tilt an entire courtroom. Hale smiled faintly, clerically pleased with himself. But then, heavy, consuming silence. The gallery went quiet. Even the creak of a wooden chair seemed like an intrusion. Everyone waited, hearts pounding, breaths held. What would the judge say? What would he do? Ellison's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. His expression betrayed nothing, yet the weight of his gaze fell on the detective like a hammer waiting to drop. It was the kind of silence that stretched seconds into eternity. And in that silence, the courtroom understood one thing. The detective had gone too far. The storm was not over. It had only just begun. Because while Halley believed he was in control, the truth was that Judge Ellison was simply waiting for the right moment to remind everyone whose word was final in that room. And that moment was closer than anyone realized. The silence from the judge lingered like a shadow over the courtroom. Every person in that room, jurors, attorneys, even the bailiff, waited for a response. But Judge Marcus Ellison did not raise his voice. He did not slam his gavel. Instead, he held his composure with the kind of calm strength only years of trial and adversity could forge. Proceed, Judge Ellison said finally, his tone level, steady, and without a single hint of the insult he had just endured. His voice was controlled, but behind that calm exterior, there was fire. He knew exactly what had been said, and what it meant. Detective Hale smirked as if he had won a small victory. He leaned forward, continuing his testimony with exaggerated confidence, tossing casual glances toward the jury, almost daring them to share in his disrespect. The courtroom wasn't just watching a case. Anymore, it was watching a battle of character. On one side stood a detective drunk on his own authority, a man who believed his badge shielded him from consequences. On the other sat a judge whose very life had been defined by patience, resilience, and the refusal to be broken by prejudice. And though Judge Ellison didn't show it, every word from the detective cut deeper than most in the room could ever. understand because this wasn't the first time. Flashbacks seemed to flicker behind his eyes. Younger days when colleagues had doubted him, when defendants had smirked at the idea of being judged by a black man, when promotions were delayed for reasons that were never spoken aloud but always felt. Each slight, each dismissal, each look of doubt had been a test of his resolve. And now, here he was, again sitting higher than he had ever sat before, wearing the robe that symbolized justice itself. And still, there were those who thought they could strip him of respect with a few careless words. But Ellison had learned long ago that dignity is not given, it is kept. The defense attorney rose to object to one of Hale's remarks, her voice trembling slightly. Your Honor, the detective's statements are veering into commentary that is both inappropriate and irrelevant. Hale snapped his head toward her with a grin. Counsel, maybe if you spent more time in the field and less time at your desk, you'd understand what relevance looks like. Laughter, nervous and stifled, bubbled up in a corner of the gallery. Even the jurors looked uncertain. Was this arrogance or confidence? Was this disrespect or just Hale's personality? The judge tapped his gavel once, the sound sharp but not loud. Detective Hale, he said, measured, deliberate. This is a courtroom, not your precinct. Choose your words carefully. The detective shrugged, pretending to comply, but his eyes still sparkled with mischief. To him, this was a game. To Ellison, it was a line being tested again and again. The prosecutor shot the judge a worried glance, as though silently asking, how much more of this will you tolerate? Judge Ellison gave no answer, no sign. He sat like stone, letting the detective reveal himself with every passing word. He knew the power of silence, how it could draw arrogance out into the open, how it could magnify each insult until it hung in the air for all to see. And the insults came, subtle but sharp. Your Honor, I'll try to explain this in simple terms. Hale sneered at one point, looking directly at the bench. Not everyone in this room has hands-on experience with criminals. Some only read about it in law books. A collective murmur swept through the courtroom. Some turned their eyes away in shame, others in anger. But Judge Ellison, he didn't even blink. Inside, though, his memory whispered reminders. The professor who once told him he'd never survive law school, the senior judge who doubted his ability to preside over complex cases, the juror who once muttered, he doesn't look like a judge. Every memory was a scar. Every scar was a reminder of how far he had come. So he waited. He let Hale's arrogance grow, unchecked, like a flame that thought itself unstoppable. Because Judge Ellison knew something Hale didn't. Fire eventually burns itself out. The jurors noticed the restraint. They leaned forward, studying the judge's stillness, sensing something profound in his silence. Even the attorneys, though anxious, began to realize that Hale's arrogance was digging a deeper and deeper hole for himself. Finally, Judge Ellison spoke again, his words calm but edged with iron. Detective Hale, this court values testimony, not theater. The truth is not measured in bravado. Continue with facts or sit down. For the first time, the smirk faltered, only slightly, but it was there. A crack in the detective's armor. The chapter of insults wasn't over, but a shift was beginning. The room could feel it. The reckless confidence of the detective was rising. Yes, but so too was the quiet, unshakable strength of the judge. The storm between arrogance and dignity was building, and everyone in that room knew that soon. Something had to give, and when it did, the courtroom would never be the same again. Before the next word was spoken in the courtroom, Judge Marcus Ellison's mind drifted just for a moment. The detective's insults, sharp and arrogant, had pulled open a door inside him that he usually kept firmly closed. And through that door came memories, whispers of an older struggle. They were memories carved deep into his soul. He remembered being a young boy, in a small southern town, standing in line outside a school where children who looked like him were told they didn't belong. The sting of the words still echoed. You'll never be one of us. Teachers had doubted him. Classmates had mocked him. Yet even then, he had promised himself one thing: he would never let someone else define what he was capable of becoming. Years later, at law school, the whispers had grown louder. Professors who praised his arguments in private seemed hesitant to call on him in class. When he raised his hand, some classmates rolled their eyes, as though his presence was a burden. He's only here because of a quota, one student muttered once, not quietly enough. Marcus heard it. He remembered every syllable, and yet he rose to the top of his class. Not because he was given favors, but because he outworked everyone else. Hours in the library, nights without sleep, pushing through doubt until his achievements spoke louder than the prejudice ever could. Still, the path was not easy. His first job out of law school placed him in a firm where clients sometimes refused to meet him. Isn't there another lawyer available? They would ask at reception. Even his white colleagues, some supportive and others quietly dismissive, reminded him daily that he had to prove himself not once, but over and over again. Those whispers of injustice followed him into every courtroom. Defendants smirked. Attorneys tested his patience. Jurors sized him up, sometimes questioning silently whether this was the man who held their fate in his hands. And then came the day he was nominated to the bench. A moment that should have been triumph turned bitter when whispers swirled behind closed doors. Too inexperienced. Not the right fit. He's ambitious, but is he really qualified? Marcus remembered sitting in a hearing where one legislator leaned forward and said, "Judge Ellison, some worry that you may not fully understand the community you'll be serving. What do you say to that?" He had stared back calmly, though inside his chest burned. He had replied, "I am the community you're speaking about. Every struggle, every barrier you mention, I've lived it. And that's exactly why I am qualified to serve it." Those words had silenced the room for a moment, but the doubts never truly went away. Now sitting on the bench years later, he carried all of that within him, the weight of being tested again and again, the scars of a system that had tried to push him aside. And here, in this very moment, Detective Hale's arrogance was not just disrespected, was an echo of all those years of prejudice. Simple terms. Hale had said, "Not everyone here knows the streets." Those words weren't new. They were the same words he had heard in classrooms, in firms, in backrooms where decisions were made, always doubting, always diminishing. The courtroom watched in silence as Judge Ellison's face remained composed, but if they looked closer, they might have seen the flicker in his eyes, the quiet fire that refused to be extinguished. The flashbacks didn't stop there. He remembered nights at home, his wife reminding him, "Marcus, you don't need to fight every battle. Sometimes dignity is in the silence." And he remembered his father's words before he passed, "Son, one day you'll sit in a seat of power, and when you do, the world will test if you belong there. Don't let them shake you. Show them who you are by what you do, not what you shout." That advice was the armor he wore now. But even armor grows heavy. Each jab from Hale threatened to chip away at it, to reopen wounds he had long since stitched closed. The jury shifted uneasily. The attorneys exchanged nervous glances. They could all sense that this wasn't just a trial about facts anymore. It was something deeper, something heavier. They were witnessing a battle of legacies. The detective smiled smugly, believing he had cornered the judge. But Marcus Ellison knew better. He had learned long ago that arrogance blinds men faster than it empowers them, so he sat in silence. He let the detective speak, let the arrogance flow freely, let the insults stack higher and higher. Because Ellison knew something the detective didn't. Dignity has its own power, and when wielded at the right time, it can bring even the proudest men to their knees. The whispers of injustice that had followed him his whole life were louder now, almost deafening. But Marcus Ellison had never let those whispers win before, and he would not start today. The courtroom leaned in, waiting for the next move, waiting to see if the judge's patience would finally snap, waiting to see if Hale would push one insult too far, because everyone in that room could feel it. The storm was building, and soon, silence would break. In the most unexpected way, the hush that had settled over the courtroom in the last chapter did not last. It cracked the moment Detective Richard Hale leaned back in his chair. One arm sprawled across the witness stand, his smirk carved deep into his face. To him, this wasn't a solemn courtroom, it was his stage. He cleared his throat, the sound deliberate, drawing eyes back to him. "You know," he began, voice dripping with self-assurance, "I've testified in more cases than I can count. Every single one ended with the jury hanging on my words. It's not bragging, it's just experience. And experience," he said, eyes sliding toward Judge Ellison, "is something you can't fake." A ripple moved through the gallery. People shifted in their seats, some with discomfort, others with amusement. A few of Hale's fellow officers, seated in the back, traded knowing grins, as though they were enjoying a private joke. The judge remained composed, his face unreadable, but the tension was climbing, like a wire being pulled tighter with each arrogant remark. The prosecutor spoke, her tone strained. "Detective, please confine your answers to the questions asked." "Oh, come now," Hale chuckled, turning his attention to the jury as if the lawyers weren't even present. "We can all agree this case is too important for half-truths or clipped answers. These people deserve the full picture. Isn't that right, folks?" The jurors shifted uncomfortably, caught between the detective's charm and his overbearing presence. His tone was laced with condescension, as if he were the only one in the room capable of guiding them toward truth. Judge Ellison finally spoke, his tone even and low. "Detective Hale, answer the questions as they are given. Nothing more." But Hale wasn't done. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course, Your Honor, I wouldn't want to make things too complicated. I'll keep it simple." The word landed like a dart. The insult was subtle but unmistakable. The defense attorney bit her lip. The prosecutor lowered her gaze. Even the bailiff shifted his weight, sensing the invisible line being crossed inch by inch. And yet Hale pressed further. He leaned forward, elbows on the stand, voice lowering into a mocking drawl. "The thing about real justice is that you can't learn it from behind a desk. You earn it on the streets, night after night, facing danger, not sitting safe, reading case files." His eyes flicked deliberately to the bench. "But hey, what do I know? Maybe books can teach you courage." Gasps fluttered across the gallery. A couple of jurors' jaws dropped. The audacity was staggering. Judge Ellison remained still, his eyes steady. Not a twitch, not a frown. But his silence only emboldened Hallie. He straightened, gesturing broadly with his hands. "Look at them," he said, sweeping his gaze over the jury. "They know. They can feel who's lived the truth and who just talks about it." Several jurors exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared move. Inside, the judge's resolve held fast, though each barb cut deeper than most could see. He thought of all the times he'd been underestimated, diminished, disrespected. This was different only in that it played out publicly, on the grand stage of justice itself. But Hale mistook silence for weakness. He grinned, lips curling in victory, and turned back to the attorneys. "I've seen the inside of more crime scenes than anyone in this room combined. I've put men behind bars who would eat half of you alive if given the chance. So forgive me if I don't bow to the authority of someone who's never gotten their hands dirty." The smirk widened. His allies in the back chuckled quietly, trying and failing to hide their amusement. But the rest of the room, they sat frozen. The tension was unbearable, pressing down on every chest, every breath. That wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was mockery, blatant, deliberate mockery of the very man who held the gavel. And though Judge Ellison sat silent, the storm inside him was no longer a whisper, it was building, rising with each insult, waiting for its inevitable release. Detective Hale didn't see it, couldn't see it. He was too busy basking in the sound of his own voice, too blind to notice that with every word, he was digging his own grave. The gallery could feel it though. They knew he was going too far, way too far. And in that unbearable tension, one thing became certain: the arrogance of Detective Richard Hale would not go unanswered. The only question was how much longer would the judge endure it before the storm finally broke. The answer was closer than anyone in that room could imagine, and with that, the stage was set for the boiling point yet to come. The courtroom was supposed to be a sanctuary of order, a place where justice spoke louder than pride. But at that moment, it felt like a battlefield. The air hung heavy, thick with unspoken tension, as the detective leaned back in his chair with the smug confidence of a man who thought himself untouchable. And then he crossed the line. "Tell me, Your Honor," the detective drawled, his voice dripping with mockery, "do you really think wearing that robe makes you any less ordinary? At the end of the day, you're just another man in a suit. Some would say the only difference is luck. Maybe a little pity too." The words rang out, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the silence of the chamber. For a moment, the room froze. Then came the sound. A sharp gasp, one from the back, then another from the gallery, until the entire courtroom seemed to ripple with shock. Heads turned, eyes widened. People could hardly believe what they had just heard. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't argument. This was humiliation livered with venom, aimed straight at the man presiding over the case. The judge sat still, his face calm but his knuckles whitening against the polished wood of the bench. Years of composure pressed against the weight of insult. He had heard prejudice before. He had endured disrespect before, but never so openly, never so brazenly, in his own courtroom. The detective smirked, mistaking silence for weakness. He leaned forward, his voice louder now. "Maybe the robe hides it from everyone else, but I see it. I see a man trying too hard to play a role he was never meant for. You want us to respect you? Then earn it." Another round of gasps surged through the chamber. Even the court stenographer paused, her fingers frozen above the keys, afraid that typing those words would give them permanence. For the first time, the mask of impartiality slipped, not in the judge's voice but in his eyes. There was fire there, restrained but undeniable, the kind that comes from wounds carved long before this day. He spoke slowly, his tone measured. "Detective, you are dangerously close to contempt." But the detective, drunk on his own arrogance, pushed further. "Contempt," he scoffed. "I think the real contempt is asking men like me to take orders from men like you. You sit up there, acting as if you're above us all, but let's not pretend. You and I both know where you came from. Some people climb ladders, others are handed them." The room erupted not with words, but with the collective gasp of an audience witnessing a line they never imagined could be crossed. Court officers shifted uneasily. Jurors exchanged nervous glances. The gallery murmured in disbelief. And through it all, the judge remained seated. His chest rose and fell steadily, but inside, the storm brewed. His dignity had been tested many times before, but never like this. This was no longer just about him. This was about every man and woman who had fought for the right to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. For a fleeting moment, silence fell again. The detective smiled, believing he had won, believing he had stripped the judge of authority with nothing but words. But those watching could feel it. The air had shifted. The weight of the insult did not crush the judge, it fueled something far greater. He leaned forward, his voice steady, commanding, each syllable deliberate. "Detective, your arrogance blinds you. You confuse cruelty with strength, and disrespect with courage. But let me assure you, this court does not bend to ego." The words rolled out like thunder, shaking the stillness. Yet before the detective could reply, a voice from the gallery broke the hush. "That's enough." A woman's cry, sharp and trembling, cutting across the chamber. All eyes darted toward her face pale, her hand clutching the bench in front of her as if holding back tears. She wasn't part of the case. She wasn't a witness. She was just a spectator, but she spoke what the room could not. The bailiff stepped closer, ready to restore order. But the damage was already done. The detective had exposed his true self to everyone watching. What was once seen as confidence now reeked of arrogance. What was once defiance now looked like cowardice hiding behind insults. And still, the judge remained calm, but no longer silent. "Detective," he said quietly, "you've forgotten where you are. You've mistaken this court for your stage. But justice is not theater, and you, sir, have just written your own downfall." The detective's smirk faltered. For the first time that day, uncertainty flickered across his face. The tension in the courtroom had reached its boiling point. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last, every glance heavy with anticipation. Something was about to break, and everyone knew it. And as the gavel hovered in the judge's hand, the chamber held its breath. Because what came next would change everything. The insult still lingered in the air, echoing louder than any gavel strike. The detective's words, dripping with arrogance, had cut through the chamber and landed like a dagger. And then nothing. No response. The courtroom froze. A silence so deep it felt alive, wrapped itself around the room. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, made your heartbeat feel like thunder in your own ears. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim under the weight. Of it all, eyes turned to one man, the judge. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. His robe draped across his shoulders like a mantle of shadow, concealing whatever storm brewed beneath. His hands rested on the bench, steady, unmoving, but the stillness itself carried power. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was louder than the detective's insult. The detective, for a brief moment, looked triumphant. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a smirk, as if he had one. But that smirk began to falter. The longer the judge sat in silence, the more unnerving it became. Seconds stretched like hours. A man in the gallery coughed nervously, the sound jolting against the still air. A bailiff shifted his weight, boots echoing too loudly on the marble floor. The jurors sat frozen, exchanging glances, their pens hovering above their notepads but making no marks. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was judgment, and the detective began to feel it. His smirk twitched. His foot tapped once against the wooden floor, betraying his nerves. He looked around, expecting anyone to break the spell. But no one dared. The courtroom was no longer his playground. It was the judge's arena, and silence was his weapon. The judge finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he adjusted his glasses, his eyes locking onto the detective. His gaze was unflinching, heavy with authority. And still, he said nothing. The detective laughed a short, awkward chuckle that rang false. "What, cat got your tongue, Your Honor?" he mocked, but his voice wavered. No response. The silence held. It grew thicker, suffocating. The gallery began to feel it, the weight of history. The years of discipline and restraint carved into the judge's very presence. This wasn't weakness. It was patience sharpened into a blade. Whispers rippled in the back rows. "Is he going to let that slide?" Someone murmured, only to be silenced by a sharp glance from a bailiff. The detective shifted again, the sweat beginning to show at his temple. His arrogance, once so bold, was beginning to look brittle under the gaze of a man who didn't need words to command a room. Then finally, the judge spoke. His voice was quiet, low, controlled, but it carried more force than any shout. "Detective, do you hear it?" The courtroom stilled further, if that was even possible. The detective blinked, confused. "Hear what?" The judge leaned forward slightly, his tone never rising. "The silence. The sound of every man and woman in this room recognizing the weight of what you've done. The silence of shame, not mine, yours." Gasps swept across the gallery again, softer this time, tinged with awe. The detective opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. The words died in his throat. For the first time, he was not in control of the stage he thought he commanded. The judge let the silence reclaim the room. He didn't rush. He didn't press. He allowed the detective to drown in it, every second dragging him deeper into his own arrogance. Even the stenographer, who had sat frozen since the insult, now resumed typing, capturing not just the words, but the gravity between them. The judge sat back again, his expression calm, as though the silence itself had spoken all that needed to be said. But beneath that calm, the entire room could sense it. He was not finished. The bailiffs waited. The jury leaned in. The audience held its breath. The silence had become a cliff's edge, and everyone knew the next move would decide whether the detective would walk away or fall. The silence was unbearable. Every second dragged like a blade against glass, sharper, louder, threatening to shatter at any moment. The detective's smirk had already faded, replaced by an and then, at last, the judge moved, not with haste, but with deliberate calm, like a man who knew the weight of every breath he took. His voice cut through the stillness, quiet at first, but steady. "Detective," he said, the single word landing heavier than a gavel strike. "You believe your badge gives you the right to mock this court. You believe your years of service place you above reproach. But let me remind you, this chamber does not bend to arrogance. It bends only to justice. The gallery stirred, whispers crackling like sparks in the silence. The detective shifted in his chair, trying to mask his discomfort with bravado. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he began. But the judge raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The judge's tone grew firmer. "Respect is not a phrase you sprinkle into sentences. Respect is conduct. It is discipline. It is the acknowledgement that no man, no matter his uniform, is above the law." The detective's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered around the room, but he found no allies. Even the jury avoided his gaze. The weight of his behavior was catching up to him. The judge leaned forward now, his voice gathering strength. "This is not the first time your name has reached my bench. Detective," he paused, letting the words sink in. "Reports of intimidation, corners cut, witnesses treated as obstacles, not citizens. And today your arrogance spilled into this courtroom like poison." Gasps rippled across the gallery. A woman in the second row covered her mouth with her hand. A reporter scribbled furiously into his notepad. Knowing history was unfolding before him, the detective tried to laugh it off, but his voice betrayed him. "You can't be serious. You're twisting this into something it's not." The judge's eyes narrowed. His voice rose, not in anger, but in power. "I am deadly serious. Because the law is not a shield for the arrogant. It is not a sword for the reckless. And it most certainly is not a toy for those who believe themselves untouchable." The tension climbed higher. Every syllable carried thunder. And yet, the judge's composure never cracked. He was controlled, unshaken, immovable. And then came the moment no one expected. The judge's voice dropped lower, sharper. "Detective, you have disgraced this court. You have disgraced the badge you wear. And in doing so, you have placed yourself above the very law you swore to uphold." He drew in a breath, then spoke the words that turned the courtroom into chaos. "Bailiff, place this man under arrest." The command struck like lightning. Gasps exploded across the chamber. A juror dropped her pen. The gallery erupted into shouts of disbelief, voices overlapping in a storm of shock. Reporters leaped to their feet, camera shutters clicking furiously. Even the seasoned bailiffs hesitated for a fraction of a second. Stunned by the audacity, the justice, the inevitability of the order, the detective shot up from his seat, his face burning red. "You can't do this. I'm a decorated officer. I've given 20 years to this city." His voice cracked between rage and desperation. The judge didn't flinch. He stared down at the man before him, his voice a calm blade. "And in those 20 years, did you believe service made you immune to accountability? Did you believe justice was only for others, never for you?" The bailiffs stepped forward now, their movements slow, deliberate, each step echoing against the marble floor. The detective backed away, his bravado unraveling into panic. "This is madness. Somebody stop this." But no one moved. The gallery sat transfixed, witnessing something they had never seen before. Man who wielded his badge like armor finally stripped of it, in the place he thought untouchable. The bailiffs reached him, hands on his arms, firm, unyielding. The detective thrashed, his voice desperate. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this, Your Honor." But the judge's reply was steady, final. "No, the only mistake would be allowing this behavior to go unanswered." The detective's words dissolved into incoherent shouts as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound of metal on metal silenced the room. And for a moment, no one breathed. The image was burned into every mind. Present the arrogant detective, once untouchable, now standing shackled beneath the authority of the law he had mocked. The judge lifted his gavel, not in haste, but with solemnity. His words rang out with finality. "Let this be a reminder. Justice is not swayed by rank, by reputation, or by arrogance. In this court, the law stands above all men." The gavel struck, and with that strike, the room erupted. Again whispers, gasps, the rustling of papers, the frantic scratching of pens capturing history. But the judge remained still, composed, his presence unmoved by the storm around him. He had delivered not just a verdict, but a reckoning. The gavel had barely struck when the shock hit the room like a tidal wave. Gasps erupted from the gallery, followed by frantic whispers that bounced off the marble walls and wooden benches. People leaned toward one another, hands covering their mouths, eyes wide with disbelief. No one had expected this. Not here, not now, for the first time in years. The courtroom had turned into something else, entirely not a place of quiet procedure, but a stage for history. The detective, red-faced and shaking, jerked against the bailiff's grip. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice cutting through the whispers. "I'm the one who built this case. I put criminals behind bars, and this is how you repay me." The bailiffs hesitated. They looked at one another, uncertain, the weight of the judge's command heavy on their shoulders. Arresting a decorated detective inside open court was unprecedented. They had been trained to uphold order, but this was different. The gallery caught their hesitation, and the tension thickened. Was the order really going to be carried out, or would the system fold under the weight of its own fear? The judge leaned forward slightly, his calm presence commanding the room without needing to shout. "Do not mistake hesitation for doubt," he said firmly. His words were sharp, clear, cutting through the noise. This court has spoken. Carry out the order. The bailiffs stiffened, their uncertainty replaced by resolve. Slowly, they tightened their grip on the detective's arms. The sound of shackles rattling filled the chamber, a sound that seemed louder than thunder. The detective fought against it, his voice rising into a furious snarl. You're making a spectacle. You think this makes you powerful? You'll regret this. All of you. His words, once laced with arrogance, now rang hollow. The gallery wasn't looking at him as a man of authority anymore. They were seeing him for what he was, a figure unraveling. Stripped of the control he thought unshakable. In the jury box. One juror leaned toward another and whispered, I've never seen anything like this. The other shook her head, eyes locked on the scene unfolding. The reporters were on fire, pens scratching furiously, cameras snapping in bursts of light. History was being written, and they knew it. The detective, voice cracking now, tried once more. Think about my service record. Think about my years on the force. I've given everything to this city. But the judge's voice was calm, unshaken. And yet today, detective, the city watches you answer for your choices. Service does not erase misconduct. Authority does not erase accountability. The gallery went quiet again. His words echoed, sharp and undeniable. The bailiffs began to move him toward the exit, each step slow, deliberate. The detective dug in his heels, refusing to go quietly. His eyes darted to the crowd, searching for sympathy, for support, for anything that would validate him. But the faces staring back told him the truth. They were not with him. One man in the gallery muttered. He thought he was untouchable. Another whispered back, not anymore. The whispers spread like wildfire, turning into a murmur that filled the chamber. A tide was shifting. The detective shouted again, desperate now. You people don't understand. Without me, this city falls apart. You'll all regret this. His voice cracked into silence when one of the bailiffs pushed him forward. The sound of his boots scraping against the polished floor. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone felt it. The judge remained composed, his presence unyielding, as though carved from stone. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't needed theatrics. Authority wasn't about volume, it was about conviction. And in that moment, his conviction stood taller than the walls around them, as the detective was dragged closer to the doors. The gallery rose to its feet, some in shock, some in awe, others in sheer disbelief. It wasn't just the arrest of a man, it was the arrest of an illusion that authority placed someone above the law. The murmurs swelled again. Did that just happen? He really ordered it. I can't believe I saw this. But amid the chaos, one truth was clear. The judge had shifted the axis of the courtroom, and as the detective's furious shouts grew distant, swallowed by the closing doors, the silence returned. This time, though, it wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of realization. A man, who thought himself untouchable, had been touched by the one force greater than his arrogance. The courtroom had always been his stage. For years, Detective Harris strutted through these walls like he owned them, chin high, chest puffed, eyes sharp with arrogance. He had mocked witnesses, intimidated defendants, and now, even dared to ridicule a judge. But in this moment, under the unforgiving silence that followed the judge's command, his swagger collapsed like glass under a hammer. The sound of handcuffs clicking open echoed louder than any gavel. Officers stepped forward, their movements deliberate, cautious, as if they were still testing the weight of the order they had just received. All eyes were locked on the man who had once commanded respect with his badge. Now, that badge seemed no shield at all. Harris's voice broke through the tension, shaky yet desperate. You can't do this. You don't know what you're doing. I've served this city for 20 years. But the words carried no authority anymore. They were thin, trembling threads, unable to hold together the crumbling wall of his pride. The officers hesitated only for a second. Then, with the judge's steady gaze fixed upon them, they obeyed. One officer reached for Harris's wrist. The detective jerked back, panic flashing in his eyes. He tried to laugh, to brush it off like a cruel joke. This is ridiculous. You all know me. I'm Harris. I trained half of you. You don't arrest mime, the one who makes the arrests. But his protest only made the moment heavier. The courtroom watched in silence, not out of sympathy, but in awe of the reversal unfolding before them. The predator was now cornered prey. As the cuffs locked around his wrists, Harris's shoulders sagged. His arrogance drained away, replaced by a raw, unpolished fear. The smirk that once sat comfortably on his lips was gone, replaced with a tight, trembling line. From the gallery, whispers rose again. Some gasped in disbelief, others murmured words like justice, and finally, the people who had once shrunk under his authority now watched him shrink before theirs. Every whisper seemed to strip him further of the power he once wielded. The judge's voice carried through the air, like heavy, unyielding. Detective Harris, your badge does not place you above the law. Your misconduct ends here, and you will answer for your actions. Those words struck Harris harder than any fist. He twisted in the officer's grip, pleading now, instead of commanding. Please, Your Honor, I didn't mean any disrespect. I was just doing my job. Please. but the desperation was naked, and the courtroom could see it for what it was: weakness. The same man who moments ago sneered with superiority now begged like a child caught in the act. The spectators leaned forward, some with eyes wide, others shaking their heads in disbelief. To see a man who once walked like a giant suddenly collapse into desperation, it was a sight that sent shivers down spines. The officers began leading him away. His boots scuffed against the polished floor, the sound sharp, humiliating, like a drumbeat of his downfall. Harris tried one last time to twist free, his voice breaking into anger. "You'll regret this. You all will. I'll get out, and when I do," but the judge's voice cut him off, firm and final. "Enough." That single word silenced the detective's threats. It carried a weight no one dared to challenge. In that instant, the power shift was absolute. The detective, once feared, was now reduced to nothing more than a disgraced figure being escorted out in cuffs. And the judge, the man Harris had mocked, stood taller than ever, an embodiment of justice itself. The courtroom was alive with emotion. Some whispered with stunned disbelief, others exchanged glances that said, "This is history." One older man in the gallery whispered under his breath, "I never thought I'd see the day." For the young law students seated in the back row, it was more than a lesson. It was a revelation. Justice was not a theory in books, but a force that could breathe, speak, and act when courage demanded it. Harris stumbled as the officers pushed him forward. The cuffs clinked with every step, each sound a reminder of his fall from grace. He looked out into the sea of faces that once admired him, feared him, obeyed him, and saw only judgment. "Don't look at me like that," he shouted, voice cracking. "You don't understand. You don't know the pressure I was under." But no one answered him. The silence of the crowd was louder than any accusation. It was the silence of people who had seen his true face, and found no pity left as the doors opened and the detective was escorted out. The air in the courtroom shifted. It was lighter somehow, as if a shadow had been lifted. The arrogance that once poisoned the room had been dragged away in chains, leaving behind a space for truth to breathe. The judge sat back, his expression calm but resolute. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to raise his voice. Justice had spoken through action, and everyone had heard it. One young woman whispered to her neighbor, "That's what real strength looks like." The neighbor nodded, eyes never leaving the judge. "That's what justice looks like." And though Harris's protests still faintly echoed in the hall outside, the courtroom no longer belonged to him. His era of dominance had ended in the same place it had thrived, in front of the people. Under the rule of law, the image of him being led away in handcuffs would stay etched in their minds. It was a moment that reversed every power dynamic, a reminder that arrogance has limits, and that those who believe themselves untouchable often fall the hardest. And yet, though the detective was gone, the ripples of his downfall were only beginning. For the courtroom, for the city, and for the judge himself, this was not the end, but the start of a new reckoning. The judge folded his hands, his gaze steady, as if preparing for what would come next, because while one man had fallen, the story of what his fall revealed was only just beginning. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind the disgraced detective, and with that sound, a hush fell across the chamber. For the first time since the tension erupted, silence was not laced with fear or confusion. It was calm, steady, almost reverent. The storm had passed, but its echoes still lingered in every heart. Judge Whitaker remained seated, his hands folded neatly on the bench. His face was composed, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who had just shouldered something far greater than a single trial. He had not only restored order, he had reminded everyone of what justice was meant to be. He inhaled slowly, letting the air fill his chest, steadying the fire that still flickered inside him. When he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, softened, yet somehow it carried further than any shout could. "Let this moment remind us," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "that justice is not a crown worn by the powerful. It is a responsibility carried by the courageous." The courtroom listened in stillness. Some sat with bowed heads, others with eyes fixed on him, as if they were hearing words they had needed their entire lives. The judge leaned back slightly, reflecting aloud, as though speaking not only to the court, but to himself. There will always be those who mistake arrogance for strength and cruelty for authority. But true leadership does not come from belittling others. It comes from standing firm when it would be easier to look away. His voice carried both pain and resolve, as if the words were born not just from principle, but from years of lived struggle. He glanced down at his hands, hands that had signed countless rulings, hands that had held both the power to condemn and the duty to protect. The weight of that responsibility was never light, and after today, it felt heavier than ever. He continued, quieter now, almost reflective. "Every decision we make in this room touches lives beyond these walls. Every ruling, every sentence, every choice echoes into the world. We must ask ourselves, did we choose what was easy, or what was right?" For a moment, his eyes shifted toward the gallery, where young law students still sat, notebooks untouched, their pens forgotten. They weren't here to record case law anymore. They were here to witness something bigger. He wanted them to remember. "Dignity," he said firmly, is not granted by a robe, a badge, or a title. It is earned by how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. Respect is not demanded, it is reflected back when we give it. And accountability. Accountability is the thread that holds justice together. Without it, even the mightiest institutions will unravel. The gallery stirred, some nodding, some fighting back emotion. For many, these were not just words, they were a call to live differently. The judge's voice softened again, but with each phrase, it carried a kind of timeless truth. I know what it feels like to be doubted before you've spoken. I know the sting of prejudice dressed up as professionalism. And I know that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is surrender. But today, we did not surrender. A hush followed, heavier than before. Even the officers who remained stood straighter. As if they too felt the gravity of what had been said, the judge allowed the silence to linger, letting the weight of his words settle in. He knew this day would be remembered not just for the fall of a detective, but for the rise of something greater, the reaffirmation that the law must serve truth, not ego. Finally, he looked down at the clerk. His expression calm but resolute. Let the record show, he said, that justice was upheld here today. The clerk nodded, pen scratching softly across paper. But in truth, no written record could capture what had just been carved into the hearts of everyone present. They had seen arrogance crumble. They had seen justice stand tall. And they had seen what courage looked like when faced with ridicule and prejudice. The judge leaned back once more, exhaling slowly, his gaze distant now, as if looking past the walls of the courtroom into the wider world. Justice is not perfect, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. It is human, it bends, it struggles, it bleeds. But it must never break. The gallery sat in stunned silence, knowing these words were not scripted, not rehearsed, they were born in the raw aftermath of truth. Somewhere in the back, a quiet clap broke the stillness. Another followed, hesitant but sincere. Then, like a wave gathering force, the room erupted into applause, not of celebration, but of respect. It was restrained, reverent, like a salute to something sacred. The judge lifted a hand gently, signaling for calm, and the applause softened. His eyes met the crowd once more, and for a fleeting second, a small smile touched his lips. He did not need their praise. He needed only their understanding. And with that, he gave a final nod. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, reverberating through the chamber like the closing line of a story they would never forget. But deep within, the judge knew this was not an ending. It was a beginning, a reminder that every day forward would demand the same courage, the same resilience, the same refusal to bow to prejudice. Because the fight for dignity and respect was not over. It had only just begun. The echoes of the gavel still lingered in the minds of those who had been present that day. But outside the courtroom, the story was only just beginning. By dawn the next morning, headlines blazed across newspapers and digital screens. Detective arrested by judge in courtroom showdown. Clips from the trial replayed on television. Anchors speaking with tones of shock and awe. Social media feeds erupted, hashtags trended worldwide. Some praised the judge as a symbol of courage. Others debated whether a man in uniform should ever be held accountable so publicly. What had begun as a heated confrontation in a single courtroom was now a firestorm, sweeping through the nation. Police precincts, officers whispered among themselves, their voices a mixture of disbelief and uneasy respect. Did you see the way he stood his ground? One officer murmured. The detective thought he was untouchable. But the judge reminded us no one is above the law. In law schools, professors replayed the footage for their students. They paused at the moment silence fell in the courtroom. Then at the precise instant, the judge gave his command. Watch carefully, one professor said. This is more than a legal ruling. It's history. It's what it looks like when integrity triumphs over intimidation. And in communities that had long felt silenced, there was a ripple of something even stronger. Hope. People who had endured mockery, discrimination, or dismissal found themselves standing a little taller. The judge's act was not just about a courtroom. It was about every space where arrogance tried to trample dignity. But for the detective, the aftermath was brutal. The once proud man who had strutted into court, believing himself untouchable, now faced suspension, investigation, and the collapse of the reputation he had spent years cultivating. Reporters swarmed outside his home. Former allies distanced themselves. The authority he had wielded like a weapon was stripped from him in days. Inside the judge's chambers, however, the mood was different. Judge Whitaker sat alone after the storm had passed, reflecting not with triumph, but with quiet gravity. He knew what the public saw: a symbol of strength, a man who had put arrogance in its place. But he also knew the cost of standing firm. Every act of courage left its mark. He closed his eyes, recalling the silence that had filled the room before his command. He remembered the doubt he had felt, the weight of what his decision would unleash. And yet, even with that weight, he knew he would do it again. Not for recognition, not for headlines, but because dignity demanded it. That evening, a journalist managed to secure a brief comment from him. His words were measured, deliberate. Authority means nothing without accountability. he said, and respect is not earned through fire, it is earned through integrity. What happened yesterday was not about me. It was about reminding us all what justice truly means. Those words spread almost as fast as the footage itself. In schools, workplaces, and households, conversations unfolded. Parents told their children the story of a judge who refused to be belittled. Students debated the meaning of power and principle. Activists found new energy. In their fight for fairness, the ripples of that single moment reached far beyond the walls of any courthouse. And yet, amid the noise of public reaction, there was one truth that stood unshaken. A detective's arrogance had crumbled, and a judge's dignity had stood tall. Days later, in a quiet community center far from the spotlight, a young man stood up during a discussion on justice. His voice trembled, but his words carried conviction. "I saw what that judge did," he said, "and for the first time, I believe that maybe, just maybe, the system can protect us, not just punish us." The room fell silent, his words resonating more than he could have known. This was the true aftermath, not the headlines, not the debates, but the subtle shift in hearts and minds. A reminder that strength was not about raising one's voice the loudest, but about standing firm in the face of disrespect. As the weeks passed, the frenzy of news coverage faded, but the memory of that day endured. The detective's name became a cautionary tale. The judge's name became a quiet symbol of courage. And somewhere in the balance of it all, people remembered that justice is not a performance, but a promise. A promise that dignity will not be mocked. A promise that authority will not go unchecked. A promise that, even when silence hangs heavy, the truth has the power to rise. And so, the story closed not with the clash of arrogance, but with the echo of integrity. A reminder that in the end, true authority is not measured by titles or uniforms, but by the courage to do what is right, even when the world is watching.